Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 524 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Mirum Podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, July the 24th, 2016. Let's get on with the show. So who are you and what do you do?
Hi, this is David Rogers. I work with companies to help them better grow and thrive in the digital age. I teach at Columbia Business School. I run workshops with companies from all over the world. I advise and consult. I speak and I write books.
Great. We're going to talk about your brand new book because you were actually recently on the show, but we did so well. I thought, let's bring it back when the book is ready to go. So the new book, The Digital Transformation Playbook, is here. And in between the time that we did the last show and this show, thank you, because you invited me to come down to New York and I spoke at the Bright Conference,
It was great to have you, Mitch. Yeah.
What an amazing event. I'd been seeing it for years, and being able to participate was quite the thing. You know, it's funny, you walk into these university environments and you hope maybe somebody will show up.
Yes, we hope that as well. It's one of the advantages. It's funny, I was just talking with somebody about this because I'm also at the American Marketing Association of New York, and we're gearing up for this year's Marketing Hall of Fame. And talking about the value of having, with events, is of building a brand, is repeating something and not doing one-offs. And that's been part of the success of Bright is, this is our 9th year. So it was not only sort of coming up with a focus, brands, innovation, technology, which gives you wiggle room that can evolve, but just repeating it, and people come back and you get a sense of what works. And you worked great. It was terrific. I got great feedback on your talk on algorithm, and everyone's saying, when's Mitch going to write this book, your next book? So
no pressure on me. No pressure.
No pressure.
But also, really big room, lots of people, very senior executives. Yeah. And what I found most interesting, which really ties into our topic of conversation around digital transformation, is that there's this real thirst for it. And I think you and I had this sort of sidebar conversation standing at the back where a lot of people were talking about it as if they're really, really neck deep in it. But quickly, I would whip out my phone and show you and then pull up things and we'd be like, both of us were sort of shaking our heads at like, wow, people are talking a good talk, but they are really fundamentally not even close to being there yet.
Yeah, I think, and to give them credit, the willingness to take action is really important. So I think it's good that the willingness is there, but in many cases, the awareness, the willingness, and need to drive change is definitely out in front of what's actually been implemented yet in a lot of organizations. We're kind of in that weird kind of cusp stage.
I call it purgatory and control alt delete.
Well, if the only problem is 10 or 20 years, then yes, that would be my definition of purgatory.
Well, that's the funny thing. I say, I call it purgatory, and people laugh, and I go, unfortunately, that was in control alt delete, which came out in I don't know what year, and what year did I write that in even? So we're in a long place of purgatory.
An author's job is foresight. If you're going to write a book, you've got to be able to take the long view, or else or write a blog post.
So here's where I want to start with you, Dave.
Sure.
Define digital transformation for me in terms of the first thing you want people to understand before we dive into the playbook components of it.
Sure. Well, as I say in the subtitle of my book, it's really about rethinking your business for the digital age. I think there's a real difference between starting a new company. The challenge of saying, okay, I'm in Silicon Valley with my pal and we're going to build something from scratch. We've got some funding. We're creating something right now in this moment of this era. And frankly, there are a lot of books actually out there about how to create the next Uber for this and Uber for that. As I joke about it, the Uber for toilet paper. And that's not what I'm kind of focused on. Digital transformation for me it's a rather different challenge to say you have a business that was started before the era of the internet. And it's already grown up. It's got customers. It's got products. It's got ways of doing business. It's got a corporate culture. It has a position in the market and scale. And now you need to change because you recognize there are new challenges and opportunities, but really very different operating environment today than in the pre-internet era. And what do you need to change and how do you get there is what digital transformation is about.
And so, again, it is a like when I hear you say that, I'm not going to disagree. It's the business I'm in. So of course, you and I are sitting on the same side of the table here, but it still feels super broad and not a bit vague. I mean, a bit vague in terms of like, what is that,
What does that mean? What does that entail? And I agree. And that's why I think, it's a little bit like big data was a couple of years ago. It sort of feels very relevant, but very ambiguous at the same time.
And my business partner would call it Jello.
Jello. So I guess I'm trying to like firm up that Jello, Mitch, and like give it a mold and put a little cherry on top and give it some structure and make it a nice edible dessert. No, that's my goal of the book is to sort of look at, and my work has always been in my research and my teaching and my advising of companies. I try to look at very different businesses, very different industries, different regions of the world, different size of organizations, to try to understand what are the common patterns between, a media company that's been around 100 years and a manufacturing business and a professional services company. And what are the changes that they have in common and what are the similar things that they need to resolve? And what I found from looking at a lot of different kinds of companies, going through a lot of different changes, is that really the essence or the heart of digital transformation is not about technology. Digital transformation is about change in your strategy and your way of thinking. And I looked at what these changes are specifically, and I organized them around what I called these 5 domains. And fundamentally, businesses just need to change some of their assumptions and the way they think about 5 sort of core domains of strategy: how we think about customers, how we think about competition, how we think about data, how we think about and practice innovation, and how we think about our value as a business and what defines us as a firm, organization, and industry, the value that we create for customers.
That's great. It's not only Jello; it's an elephant. It's a Jello elephant.
It's a broad question, and I didn't want to give a sort of overly simple or narrow answer. It'd be very easy to write a book about digital transformation in the magazine business or digital transformation in consumer packaged goods or something like that. But I wanted to look at what are the real changes, the more fundamental changes that cut across all of these. And it really does have to do with, businesses grew up under different circumstances and they grew up with very sort of different underlying assumptions about what your relationship is to a customer. We're shifting from a world where customers were effectively treated as targets. Customer relationships were built on scale, economies of scale, and we used mass marketing and mass production to come up with, looking at aggregates of individuals and saying, what's the product and service that'll suit the needs of as many of them as possible? How do I mass produce that at scale to reduce my marginal costs? And then how do I use mass channels of distribution and mass channels of communication? What are the few programs, radio stations, magazines, et cetera, that most customers who I'm trying to reach are listening, reading, watching. And then I'll use the same singular message and I'll push it out to them effectively. That was how customer relationships were built in the 20th century. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. But although we might say that, a lot of us still run our businesses in a way that is predicated on that old model versus the model that I talked about in my last book of customer networks, right? Thinking about customers as a network, that the relationships and the connections, interactions between them and reciprocally between them and you is just as important as what you are offering or communicating to them.
So is what you're saying, if I can translate that from, if you're going to talk about transformation, let me bucket them in 3 and then you correct me if I'm off on this, but you're talking about from masses to networks, and then I would think the win off the networks is to get hyper-personalization. Would that be fair?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely I mean, I talk about sort of five ways of creating new value in customer relationships through access, meaning a more immediate, on-demand, instant, simpler, easier experience, engaging them with content, customizing, which is with kind of personalization, one-on-one you talk about, connecting with them, becoming part of the social interactions between customers and businesses and customers and each other. And lastly, collaborating. That's when you're not just conversing and sharing ideas, but you're actually working towards some kind of shared goal. So those are 5 customer strategies that I talk about in the customer chapter. But each of these domains has gone through just as much change. You know, if you think about competition, we used to traditionally think of competition in very, straightforward ways. It was competition was a zero-sum game. You competed with other businesses that looked like you, that had the same kinds of products and services as you did, similar business model or identical business model. And if they won, you lost, and vice versa. Sometimes you talk about growing the pie. But the overall principle was you competed with companies who looked like you, and then those were your competitors, and then you had partners. And now those principles, those assumptions just don't hold anymore. I mean, companies that are built in the digital era, if you look at them all, they are competing and cooperating with the exact same businesses. You know, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple. These companies are each other's biggest competitors and each other's biggest partners in doing business, and they recognize that. Microsoft as well. You know, you have to learn to, co-opetition was the book by Adam Brandenburger that's completely relevant to this era. You have to learn, or you think of them as frenemies. So you have to sort of learn to be both partners and competitors with the same business. And you also have to recognize that your biggest competitors may not be symmetric competitors, right? It may be an asymmetric competitor who is solving the same problem for the customer, but with either a completely different product or service, or maybe a roughly equivalent service or product, but built on a completely different business model.
It's a humorous time for me to be having this conversation specifically with you because I'm coming off of reading an article earlier this morning from the ARF, the Advertising Research Foundation, and they just held their big event also in New York, and they had what they call, their sort of stunning findings and surprises from the research. Number one, TV is the single most important medium to advertising ROI. And, if you were going to put a headline as your number one bullet point that's going to make me fall off a chair and get angry, that would probably be the one, considering my pedigree of digital marketing for the years I put against this and finally seeing the fruition and, work of my labor come to be valid in the marketplace. You hear that and you go crazy.
Somebody came up with a magic hat to measure ROI of television.
Yeah, exactly. But let's put that aside. If you sort of dig into the conversation, the flaws that they're talking about, which are to me equally humorous, are the fact that most brands are not even doing any form of pre-testing for the 20 or 30K it might cost them. A/B split testing was one of the other components that are talked about in terms of cost, ROI on doing that, and value and how that's rolled out. And I think about this sort of grand scope of this elephant jello that we just talked about, and I drill it down to, the industry you and I are primarily in, which is marketing. And I think, how are we going to move? How are we going to move to true transformation if we live in a world where even on the area where they're spending the most spend and can actually affect that spend through pre-testing, and that pre-testing isn't even A/B testing. These are different formats as well.
Right.
How are we going to move this pebble up that hill?
Well, I think experimentation is a key point. I mean, is a key part of getting there and ingraining that in the culture of every organization. I mean, that's actually chapter 5 to bring it back to the book. No, when I talk the chapter looking at innovation, the main focus is how do you shift innovation? And marketers are just as guilty of this as anyone. In fact, probably we're the worst.
Because we talk about it like we do it and we know everything.
Innovation is like, marketers they think innovation is creativity. Coming up with an idea is innovation. That's not innovation. That's essential to innovation. But innovation is coming up with an idea that has an impact. So it has to be an idea that has some kind of result or outcome or market fit, depending on what kind of idea it is, and then that you actually can bring it to fruition, and then you have an impact. That's innovation. But still, even if you accept that, marketers come from, understandably, this world of where everything was predicated on the big idea. It's Don Draper smoking a cigarette and coming up with a brilliant insight in Mad Men. And so we thought that innovation was just about coming up with the idea and then making a big bet on it. And that has completely changed. And the world we're in now is one where innovation needs to be much more driven by, and when it works, is much more driven by continuous rapid experimentation. And I break that out in the book because it sometimes gets a little confusing because there are actually very different kinds of experiments. And some of them are things like A/B tests, where you actually have a very concrete question. You're trying to say, well, which of these 4 images will get more customers to click on my message, my direct response piece. That's very important. And companies that are really digitally driven are ingrained in, whenever there's an option to A/B test, to run what I call a convergent test. You're converging on the answer out of a defined set of options. You do it, and it just becomes part of how people breathe. And I've met these companies. They don't talk about convincing people. It's just everyone knows. Of course, why wouldn't you do that?
In fact, to push that further, I've seen examples of this that I've given in presentations and writing where they've changed the dynamics so much by doing it incrementally and very strategically that people actually physically come to work each day saying, like, what are we going to mess with today? Which is a complete paradigm shift from where they were literally 6 months prior to that.
Right. Rather than it's somebody's job is somebody's the research team or the experimenting lab or something who does that, and the rest of us just do our thing. No, everything you do, you come to work and you say, okay, what are we going to tweak and play around with and try to learn? But it is, and to your point of pre-testing versus A/B testing and so forth, there are others forms of learning which are more based around prototypes, around exploratory discovery. It's before you have the question completely defined, but they're just as important. And it's just important that you build an organization around that kind of thinking, where you're really focused on identifying the questions you're trying to answer through innovation, rather than saying, I came up with an idea and I'm emotionally committed to it. This is my idea, and I'm going to ignore any evidence, perhaps from the market or otherwise, that might lead me to just improve on the idea, or maybe find out that, guess what? Most of the time, bold ideas, the majority of them don't work, and that's fine. The companies who are innovating based on experimentation, their rate of failure is actually no better. And they'll tell you that. Our ideas are not better. Most of them don't pan out. But we're able to validate, explore, pursue, develop many more ideas per quarter, per $1,000, whatever your constraint is, because they're organized around this idea of constantly learning and tinkering, as you said.
Yeah, and I love the example that I think highlights it best, and I think it's good for people to anchor around, is what Oreo did with their color field project, rather, this holiday season, where they leveraged their 40 million plus Facebook likes fans, and of course they were paying to access them, but still that's a good enough user base for them.
Yeah.
They created this little microsite where you have the template, you fill in the colors you want for this Oreo package, and for 12 or 15 bucks they send it to either you, or if you want to send it as a gift during the holidays, and completely sold out. That did great, but it had a lot of things around rapid experimentation. It had a lot of things around innovation, and it had a lot of what you were saying in terms of this one-off, because what people don't know about the platform is it was built on Shopify.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like this massive infrastructure, huge thing. They had the Facebook fans there. It didn't really affect Oreo.com. They tried it. It worked. If it didn't work, delete the Shopify account. No one's none the wiser.
Exactly.
And I really, and again, the reason I like it as an example, and as something I point to as a bit of a lighthouse, is because it's an unsuspecting client. It's Mondelez International. It's a huge multinational. They were pushing serious boundaries by going DT, direct to customer, consumer, rather than doing it through all their retailers, which they have to maintain those relationships with. I just felt like, for my dollar, from a marketing standpoint, even speaking to what you're talking earlier about what innovation is, not just a better mousetrap for your advertising, which again is right aligned with one of my sort of core pillars of thinking now. I love those things because if they fail, it costs next to nothing, and if it did well, it costs next to
Exactly, and
nothing.
that's the value. And Mondelez actually do mention in the book. They've set up these kind of labs. They call them the Fly Garage, I believe, to get in front of customers and just to be able to test these minimum viable prototypes and throw an idea out there and get feedback and be learning, constantly from the customers. But the benefits of experimentation, one of the, I think it's maybe the first one that I mentioned, is exactly what you said. The cost of learning goes down. When the price of failure is a fraction of what it was before, because you're doing it in a much more immediate and rapid fashion, it gives you the license. Yeah, no one wants to fail in the sense of something that's incurring catastrophic impact on the organization. But when you can fail really affordably and cheaply and learn from it and then find the ones that don't fail and really scale them up and move ahead with them, that is a great recipe for success, to put a pun on colored Oreos.
I want to sort of get a bit semantic with you and how you think and how you move, because when we talk about digital transformation, again, one of your core buckets in your 5 domains is innovation. Innovation is a word we keep hearing. It is as buzzworthy today as the word transformation in and of itself. And I actually think for the vast majority of companies that aren't that sort of Silicon Valley garage based, built it in a cafe and got $1 billion, became a unicorn overnight, it's overwhelming. And so you also talk about adapting. And I was wondering, is adapting stage one to get you to innovating, or can companies simply adapt slightly, or this for transformation, they have to completely be innovative?
Well, I wouldn't put innovation on a pedestal. That innovation has to be, this big, bold, out of the box, radical kind of idea. I would define it, and I think I do in the book, innovation is basically any change to a business innovation. Any change to your product, service, or process that adds value. And that can range from very incremental improvements to the creation of something that's totally new and unprecedented. I think I talk about, just to show that kind of contrast, Google is constantly tweaking and A/B testing literally just the search results that you get. Part of it, how it's innovating, is like when you start typing in a few letters and it guesses what you're trying to search on, which is such a wonderful feature on your mobile device. It's constantly learning and trying to improve those sort of search completion guesses. Those tiny little features you see rolling out on Google Maps every month or so. You're like, oh, that's a little thing they slipped in there. Versus coming up with Google Maps, right? Launching Chrome, big bets, big ventures. Innovation runs that scope. So I don't think it's helpful to sort of put innovation on a pedestal and say this is like your radical new product. Innovation should be every process and element of the business that people are invested in thinking about how can we add more value to it.
So, and again, I'm sort of having a bit of a pregnant pause here, because at the Bright event, I managed to finally meet in his protein form, Michael Schrag, who a huge admirer of his work, and I know you are as well.
Yeah.
And I believe one of the theories of innovation that he brought forward was this idea that it's not just the stuff we've talked about, but that innovation is when you actually get a customer to pay a premium to adopt something that is radically new. Do you prescribe to that, or not really?
That is a great goal.
Not to make you fight him on this, but
no. I mean, I'm not sure that he would say that
solely
every innovation is that either. I mean, I think that is, if you're thinking about as a great measure or way of defining, if you're innovating a consumer product or service. Although you may also want to be innovating something where they're not necessarily paying a premium. I mean, if you look at things like,
but it could be a
brand theory, the value can be a premium price. It can be increased volume. It can be, customer lifetime value can come from add-on selling. It can come from, reducing attrition, right? If you do something that makes that same customer not pay a premium, but stay on average doing business with you longer, That's an increase in customer value. But frankly, you can innovate your internal processes. A lot of these companies like Intuit, who I talk about, how they used, effective experimentation to develop, a new product for small farmers in India. They're also using the same approach to improve their own internal paperwork, so that when you have to file an expense report, it's not so damn annoying and cumbersome and things like that. Their legal process. They're saying everything in the business, everything we do can be improved if we take this, this innovator's approach to constantly tinkering and learning and improving.
Okay, so you and I are not only have we been converted, we might actually be priests in this church. I mean, it's true. And again, you don't have to be digital native or not. I think you and I, when Don Tapscott talks about, I love that line when he talks about digital natives or born digital, he talks about them being bathed in bits. Yes. And I always think that nice. And I love Don, but I was bathed in bits too. Just, connectivity happened to come a little bit later because of my age and demographics. But,
you were reborn.
Exactly. I've been baptized.
The church of digital.
Exactly. Yes. But so what I find really challenging is when I see companies struggling to adopt to digital. And what I mean by that is, if I were to take and go back several years, IT infrastructure, legacy systems, very, very expensive, cost to entry, pipeline of technology, the ability to transmit data back and forth. And, I jokingly, I don't know if I said this on stage at Bright, but one of my sort of little nuanced things that likes to get tweeted out is when I talk about how we've hit, I really believe that what the iPad and the evolution of the iPhone did is it helped us remove technology from technology. Like those barriers that were massive hurdles are gone. You want to have a software service Salesforce integration. I mean, customization is one thing, but it's basically a line of code. And there's a lot of softwares that you can put in that's basically a line of code or subscription service, and off you go to the races. When you look at this, why is that struggle so real for companies? Why don't they just go, hey, sucks that we invested all this money in this IT infrastructure, but here's $6 a seat for this thing, and it's significantly better. It's cloud-based, and off we go to the races. Why do they struggle so much with this?
When you say the struggle, just to tease this out, do you mean why do they struggle if they've sort of thrown a lot of money in one approach, a very own it, build it kind of IT philosophy? Why are they having trouble kind of stepping back from that? Or are you saying now that it's gotten so easy and you don't have to throw all this money at it, why are they still not getting going?
Let's do both and. Let's do both and. Why do companies struggle to adopt to digital? If we are truly in a place where I think you and I would agree that technology has removed technology from technology, the barriers to do it are very minimal.
Exactly, and that's why I said digital transformation is not about technology, not anymore. And so if you've invested in a lot of it, there's always the sunk cost fallacy. You say, well, we've spent all this money in one approach, so therefore that is a rationale to keep going down that approach, which any economist will tell you is illogical and has no actual validity, but it is a human psychological bias. But it's also people's jobs and people's careers and the way they work. Look, we're in this shift in terms of the IT departments from the world of the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, to the CDO, the Chief Digital Officer. And I talk about that in the book. What's the difference, right? Is this just a fancy new title? It actually isn't. It's a very different role for technology leadership, because the old role, the paradigm of the CIO, was someone who is helping the organization use technology to do what it does better, and particularly better in terms of more efficiently and more safely. You're supposed to reduce risk or avoid new risks, minimize new risks, and increase efficiency, reduce costs, etc. You weren't supposed to figure out what the business should be doing or where it should be going. Now you do. That's the Chief Digital Officer. Technology is now all about strategy. And the role, the paradigm of the Chief Digital Officer is thinking about how technology creates new opportunities, new threats, and help define, where the business is going, where you're going to evolve, what your value proposition is going to be, what industry are you going to be in, A lot of people think Tesla is a car company, right? They're in the news today because their Tesla 3 got unveiled. Elon Musk did not start Tesla to start a car company. He doesn't think of it as a car company. It's an electrical power company.
Okay.
And just like
it's funny because I just recently saw a conversation with Reid Hoffman at The Economist, Reid from, of course, LinkedIn, and obviously a massive venture capital. And his thought was that it's not a car company; it's the first software car company, which I thought was an interesting take too.
Interesting, yeah, and others are competing to be in that space, but Musk's driving ambition was to bring electrical power to things that are running on fossil fuels, and so the product he sort of wanted to build was great electrical batteries that could have a lot of applications, and he thought, well, how we're going to need several years of R&D development and runway to get to where these batteries need to be in terms of cost versus output, to be able to afford this. So how do we get going and start bringing in money to spend years doing that and building it to scale? And he figured out the first product to start with was a luxury automobile, not an automobile, but a luxury automobile, because the margins would be high enough that could get you to the next stage and then to the next stage. So, that this is what chief digital officers working at, the New York Times or the Metropolitan Museum or Encyclopedia Britannica or Fujifilm or any of these companies that didn't get disrupted. Everybody loves to talk about Kodak and Blockbuster, but not everybody gets disrupted. And the companies that don't, it's because they're thinking about how do these technologies create new opportunities? Where is our business going to go? And they're not beholden to, well, we've printed encyclopedias for 200 years, so we have to keep printing encyclopedias. Well, we started as a car company, so we absolutely must be a car company into the future. Well, maybe not, maybe, something in between. So it's a very different role for technology. So that's one of the things that's a challenge for businesses. And the other is that, changing your thinking is hard. It's actually much harder than changing your technology than writing a big check to IBM to install either hardware or a cloud solution. Changing how you're thinking about your business is really hard, and that's what I focus on in the book. Just as an example, talking with one of actually IBM's clients, the head of data analytics for Coca-Cola. And he talked with me about, he actually spoke at the Bright Conference last year, and he talked with me about how a lot of really interesting things that were going on as Coca-Cola, a company like Oreo that used to do nothing direct to consumer, and now is very much invested in this idea of customers as networks. And literally their last CMO talked about the 3 different customer networks when he talked about their strategy for their business. What Mike Weaver told me is the biggest challenge was not, okay, do we pick, which cloud solution do we pick? And is it local or in the cloud or hybrid and so forth, and getting all the hardware and spending the money? The biggest challenge, he said, was the business process. Our jobs actually have to change. And figuring that out first before we implement a solution, he said, was the really tough part. As marketers, Coca-Cola grew up in an era where you came up with that one brilliant idea, the polar bear and the whatever it is, in a given year, the jingle, give the world a Coke, and you execute that one brilliant, beautiful, shining thing, and you put it out there. Now, he says, all these marketers come to me, and they say, I've got this great idea, and I have to tell all of them all, that's terrific. Can you give me 80 different variations on it? So I can not just run A/B tests, but actually personalize and test different versions and figure out what's going to connect with different audiences and different contexts. And that is the bigger challenge, not setting up the actual technology.
Okay, so when we talk about transformation, I'm curious because you sort of started traipsing into some very unique examples, and I wasn't sure where you were going to go with Fujifilms or MoMA and things like that. Yeah. But again, when we typically think of stories of transformation, we, again, Apple, you talked about Intuit, we talked about Tesla. These are sort of the ones that, the regurgitation of them that we hear from everybody, and it's you have to because they are the stories. But you're doing this book, you're very, very research based in how you think and how you operate. Give me a transformation story from a strange place that really surprised you, or are we not there yet?
Oh, no, there's lots of them. If we want to talk about one of the cases I talk about in the chapter on value and rethinking your value proposition to the market, and adapting that is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm looking forward at my New York book launch in 2 weeks. I'm going to have my friend Srinivasan, who's their chief digital officer, is going to be there talking about the Met. And they are really thinking differently about what the role of a museum is in the digital era. And it's not about, obviously, it is still at the core, face-to-face, standing in a room, looking at works of art, but thinking about, well, okay, let's not make this artificial distinction between online and offline, which is increasingly a very poor way of thinking about things. Let's think about what is the role of culture and art and aesthetics and history and how we experience it and interact with it today. And let's evolve that value that we're creating for our audiences. And they're doing everything from video storytelling, when a painting that is acquired by the Met and would traditionally take 9 months to be prepared and archived and documented and restored and cleaned up before it goes on the wall. In the old days, nobody's heard anything about that painting until it appeared on the wall. Now they're telling stories in short form video, and they find people all over the world are fascinated to see about, how the baby's foot on this beautiful, Renaissance painting is being cleaned up with the tools being used, and about the history and where it came from and how they acquired it. They're having hackathons where they have, data scientists and performance artists taking their data that they've created about all the works in the Met and mashing it up with, Jay-Z and Kanye West lyrics, so that you can be listening to a song and seeing this collage of different works from, a history of human art and culture that connect to it thematically. I mean, they're doing all kinds of things beyond the sort of obvious. Yes, they've got a great mobile app, which makes it, which is a wonderful tool for coming and planning your visit. But they're really thinking about what's the role of art and culture today. So that's, an example of not on the typical short list.
Yeah, and I'm also I'm sort of left wondering, is that real business transformation, or are those marketing innovations to stay fresh, if you know what I mean? And I'm not trying to, are those really sort of full business, we're changing how we do business, or is that just here's some nice little flashy things that have digital accoutrements to make us look hip?
No, I mean, at that organization, that's kind of a hard question to ask without knowing a little bit about what's happening on the inside.
Right.
And knowing Sri, I know that this is not a little team of him and 5 people off in a corner kind of
parlor tricks,
their social media accounts and parlor tricks. He's the right-hand man of the director of the whole museum, who's actually pushing some of the ideas that Sri is leading. He has a team of dozens of people, and they're embedded in every aspect, like I said, from acquisition and curation to audience engagement, every stage of the process. And that's important. And I talk in terms of organizational change in the book about how do you shift from, how do you need to be able to go back and forth from incubating new ideas to really integrating them at scale.
So a company, small, medium, large, B2B, B2C, doesn't matter. They pick up the book, Digital Transformation Playbook. They're like, we're just going to follow the playbook. We're going to read each thing, do our notes, do the workshops. We're going to bring David and pay him an exorbitant amount of money. You're smiling. Everyone's happy. Baby's got shoes. It's fantastic. I'm curious about the role of the CMO in that process. Mm-hmm. And then I'm really curious about the role of the CMO once it's rolling.
Well, and that's going to depend on the organization. Like I talked before about the CIO versus the CDO. And I use those terms as sort of markers to talk about a change. And in actual fact, in some companies, the name isn't changing. I was working with GE and a group of their CIOs, and it's just the role of the chief information officer is changing. And it's, as they said, to me, it's very much becoming wedded to, it's actually demand generation. So they're getting very much into marketing. And some of those business units may or may not have a CMO, so it depends. The role of the CMO very often is, in companies that have a strong CMO, they are very often the champion or one of the key champions of digital transformation. I think there's a couple sort of organizational reasons why. A lot of this is driven by customer relationships. It's market driven. That's why change has to happen and why businesses are willing to change, because they recognize that the customers are going someplace and they're going to get left behind if they don't figure out how they still fit into the customers' lives. And so the challenge is when you have companies where the CMO has been really kind of a chief advertising officer or a chief communications officer. But if you have a company where the chief marketing officer has really been already been in a sense the chief customer officer, the person who's most responsible for the customer relationship, then as a lot of different sort of traditional functions within the business get integrated, and that customer relationship is now clearly can't be addressed without looking at communications and customer service and product development and innovation, a lot of other things. Then often we see the CMO as sort of finding themselves at the center, and their responsibilities are expanding, which can be stressful but exciting. And frankly, a lot of companies that have a chief digital officer, if you actually look at the job description, they're really a CMO with a new name.
So last thought that I'm curious about, and this is completely selfish and self-serving, and this is why I do a podcast, because I can corner smart people like you and ask you the questions that I'm juggling with, is company goes through the transformation. They've done it successfully. They're there. What's the value of people like me, the agency, to them now?
Well, I think an agency partner is still valuable and always will be valuable. I mean, hopefully,
right answer.
I would say
Correct.
They can get a lot more value out of a good agency relationship. I mean, the agency's job, I think, is not just to be. I mean, yes, to spur change, and that's going to be something that's change is not done. It's not digital transformation. Okay, we did that, and now we figured out everything. It's more about setting up a path where you are going to be continuing to evolve, and you're going to be changing and adapting into the future, maybe in some of the areas that you didn't use, the things you used to take for granted as static, like what industry am I in? What's my value proposition to the customer? And a great agency partner is somebody who brings in, I think, fundamentally a breadth of perspective. They're looking at issues like the issue you're facing today, but they've been looking at it from a lot of different angles for different kinds of organizations, and therefore they can have certain kinds of specialists as well that they're going to come in to be able to bring in, an additional perspective and ideas to help you tackle that problem. So that's not affected. It's not changed.
I love to hear it, and I think it's a great place to end. I can't thank you enough for your time. The book's called The Digital Transformation Playbook. It's fantastic, and I really do think you break it down, you make it digestible, you make it actually really workable for people to work through this. There's some great frameworks in there to think about. I was going to jokingly say that I think we should do this again once we've already transformed, but I fear that we'd be old and in rocking chairs at that point. So let's do that sooner. David.
We'll find another occasion or topic to chat again soon.
Let people know where they can best connect to all your stuff.
So you can find me or the book either at davidrogers.biz, that's .biz, that funky little domain name, or digitaltransformationplaybook.com. They both go to the same place, and you can both find me there to be in touch and find my social media links, as well as finding content about the book, a free sample chapter to download if you want to peruse it, and just fun stuff that's coming out, blog posts, recent research events, and so forth.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Mitch. Great to chat with you.